So first of all, on behalf of the Focus E15 housing campaign and also of my own organisation, the Revolutionary Communist Group, I want to thank Éirígí very much for inviting us to speak. It's a huge honour and a great opportunity to address you all. And obviously some of the situations we speak about in Britain will be different to what's going on in Ireland. But from what I've heard from the speakers here, there'll be a lot of similarities and we'll be fighting a lot of the same enemies. I was reminded when John Douglas was talking about what's going on here with the attacks on education, with the appalling attacks on working conditions and hours, the poverty levels, what's happening with housing. More than 150 years ago, the great revolutionary Frederick Engels chronicled the living conditions of the working class in England. And he looked at London and he looked at Manchester. And as I'm sure you're aware, some of the most appalling conditions that existed in Manchester, the slums, the overcrowding, the insanitary conditions, actually existing side by side with fantastic housing for the wealthy, for the industrialists, for the privileged. A lot of the, from the worst housing was that of Irish migrants who'd been brought over to England to do some of the worst jobs, and that's part of that imperialist history of Britain's control of Ireland. Anyway, so he was talking to an industrialist and he was walking along the road telling him how appalling the housing was, how terrible the situation for the working class was in Manchester. And this industrialist listened to him very politely. They walked along the road. And when their ways parted, he tipped his hat to him and said, "Yes, indeed, sir, but there is good money to be made here." And I think that's what we come down to, isn't it, with the housing crisis. There is good money to be made here for some. The commodification of housing, the turning of a basic human need into something to be bought and sold, to be invested in, to be made profit out of, while people sleep on the streets or in temporary accommodation or in slum-like overcrowded housing, is what it's all about. There is good money to be made here. So that just what occurred to me as I was listening to John speaking. Now, I know not all of you who are here today will be familiar with the work of Focus E15. It is is still, and in its heyday kind of was inspiringly so, one of the most dynamic housing campaigns to emerge in Britain in recent years in response to a growing crisis in housing for the working class. Much as here, I think, publicly owned housing, council housing, is being sold off, is being demolished, and is not being replaced. Indeed, it's categorised now as brownfield housing, as brownfield land, ripe for redevelopment. That's the contempt, if you like, with which the ruling class speak about working class homes. It's replaced, people are decanted, so-called regeneration takes place, and it's replaced with flats for private sale, private rent, or so-called, occasionally a tiny percentage of so-called affordable housing that I think probably here, as in Britain, is not affordable for the working class. Homelessness is growing exponentially in Britain. Rough sleeping has risen 169% since 2010, and that's just the most visible side of homelessness, with many people living for years in inadequate temporary accommodation with prison-like regulations, often damp, often vermin, often Category 1 hazards. Those living in temporary accommodation, it has risen in the same period 58%, and it includes thousands of children for more than the 6 months that it's supposed to be the legal limit. But in reality, people spend years and children grow up in cramped single rooms with no hope of ever having a decent place to live. And yet, meanwhile, huge investments in land via the City of London, the insurance companies, hedge funds, I mean, everybody wants a piece of this investment in land, is generating vast profits for corporate investors, making swathes of London and the southeast unaffordable in big cities for ordinary people to live in. And we see this in Newham, which I'm going to come to talk to you about, where the Olympic Games were held and there was massive investment in infrastructure, shiny new buildings went up. You should see it. It's wonderful. And yet the actual legacy of that Olympic investment has been that Newham has the highest level of homelessness in Britain, with 1 in 25 people homeless. it has the highest rate of decanting working class people out of the borough and to other cities around the country. And it's out of those conditions that the Focus E15 campaign emerged. And so maybe just to introduce you to it, I'm just going to show a very short film, 5-minute film, that in fact in this case was put together by The Guardian to give you a bit of a flavour of it before I say any more.
Stand up and fight, you know, take a chance, be brave.
Yeah.
You don't have to fucking be scared of them.
Basically, we've got 2 councillors on the camera chatting a load of shit.
Where?
It's on this estate that have been empty for over 8 years.
There was a regeneration plan, it fell through. Yeah?
Gentrification. I'm paying £249 a week rent. Private rent,
Yeah.
right? Do you think that's affordable?
No, our economy doesn't work properly. What we need to do is
Well then,
change
do
the
you know what?
economy.
What we need to do is get you people out of fucking power and get people like us in, because it's people working for the people these days. It's not you lot working for us, how it's supposed to be. Yeah. It's communities working together to get the shit done.
Welcome to Newham, proud host of the Olympics and the regeneration boom that has come with it. Less proud, perhaps, to have 24,000 people on its housing waiting list.
When do we want housing? When do we want it now?
And certainly not proud of how it has handled a campaign led by local single mothers who were issued eviction orders from a hostel called Focus E15. The women were rehoused temporarily in Newham, but were worried they would be moved out of London. When they occupied 4 homes on a social housing estate that the council had been depopulating for 8 years, they became the faces of the London housing crisis.
Right, so we haven't done any work for these flats, we've just given them a basic clean. This is in a bedroom. We've now got it as a children's playroom. Absolutely lovely. Like, it's such a shame that it's been boarded up for so long.
Their campaign to raise awareness of housing issues and to return the Carpenters' estate to social housing has been a lesson in local activism. 1. Take direct action.
Decorating one of the rooms in this flat.
2. Get the community on your side.
But what they're doing is the only way they're ever going to get any voice in this borough.
3. Get the media interested. 4. Get celebrity backing. And use it all to hold local powers to account.
We are members of the public and we deserve to have our say as well.
5 seats in the public gallery, and we have 2 private
seats for the hall. 5 seats.
Every time we come here to lobby, we are never allowed in the public gallery. And Robin Wales does a very courageous speech.
The council, led by Mayor Robin Wales, found itself with a PR mess on its hands. Wales had called the occupation despicable and refused interviews, while the council issued an eviction order. But the battle was already wider than one occupation. The Newham mums have inspired and linked up with other housing activists, and they've begun an ongoing fight back against local evictions. Away from the publicity of their own case, 2 of the campaigners are supporting Jessica, another young woman going to court facing immediate eviction.
Just think like something about this campaign being so local and so immediate, and I feel like it's working. We've just won an adjournment for this woman. so you've got somewhere to live until then. If this girl had turned up today all by herself, I've no doubt in my mind they would have evicted her.
And then it was their turn to have their day in court.
Today we're standing in court. We're demanding social housing, not social cleansing, for Carpenters' estate to be repopulated and to be run by the residents of the estate. We have decided to leave 80 to 86 Doran Walk on our own accord by the 7th of October. We have reached our goal to highlight the issue of decent homes left empty on the estate. This is the beginning of the end of the housing crisis.
The victories that we've gained, even though they're small, one of the best experiences of my life. I will look back at this across the whole of my life as one of the most important things I was ever involved in.
It's quite sad, it's coming to an end, but it is just the beginning.
I'm going to miss them quite a lot. They've become, to me, like an extended family.
Never you to see I make the jigger look.
I'm sorry for the pain that I've caused. I've been listening to your reason, it makes no sense at all.
So that's a little taste of Focus E15 campaign, and what's amazing, I think, about it is how really a group of young working class women who'd never been involved in politics in their lives before, who had never organised, who suddenly, partly through a chance meeting, in fact, with our organisation, I'm not doing this very well, am I? Just give me a minute. Can you hear me if I speak like this? Yes. Fine. So after a chance meeting, actually, with my organisation, who supported them and helped them to organise, but through their own determination, willpower, refusing to compromise at any stage, held power to account. They faced down a council which had total contempt for them. They went to see the mayor, Labour mayor of Newham, Robin Wales, and they told him about the problem early on. They went to the people who were meant to help them, and he just said, well, if you can't afford to live in Newham, you can't afford to live in Newham, can you? And people didn't want to know. They thought they were scum. They were young, teenage mums. And they forced a change in the narrative in Britain, and actually internationally. They were on every news channel after this occupation of a socialist state that had been left empty, deliberately run down, deliberately decanted, so that it could be sold off and regenerated. And still today, this was in 2014, still today the future of Carpenters is up for discussion and up for debate about it being repopulated by local homeless people and used as publicly owned housing. And that was an extraordinary victory when you look at everywhere where we see homes being bulldozed and rebuilt. And what did they do? I mean, in the year, they were formed in 2013, post-Olympic legacy. And as I say, they were in a homeless hostel that was going to be shut down. They were going to be sent out of London, miles from their support structures, families, any kind of, some of them had jobs, just decanted out of the borough. And they already wanted to organise against this. And they bumped into us, they said, oh, you've got a good petition, because we were, I don't know, working against the bedroom tax or something. How do we get a petition like that? So that kind of help, helping in organising, was really crucial. But more important was the energy and the being outside traditional means of organising. They'd never organised before. They didn't know you need to, I don't know, write a letter to your MP, although I think they did try and get something out of their MP, but that was useless, or politely lobby Parliament or do something. So they occupied show homes owned by the people who were running the hostel. And they went in with the kids and they held a children's party in one of the show homes, for example. They hired a bus and did a tour, sort of singing, sharing tour, all the way to City Hall and got publicity to do that. And they continued to talk about the fact that it wasn't just about them. It was about everybody who was being forced into either temporary accommodation that was inadequate or out of the borough altogether, and that what was needed was a programme of publicly owned social housing. And in the end, all those who wanted were rehoused in the borough, all in spite of threats from the mayor, threats from his thugs, attempts to buy them off, offering them washing machines, being put at the top of the housing list, and they were like, no, we're fighting on a wider campaign. There's a tendency when people talk about Focus E15, though, to simply go, oh, this amazing grassroots campaign. And I think we have to think a little bit about that, about why did Focus E15 succeed as far as it, and is still going strong today when so many others have failed. Because spontaneous movements will emerge. In the conditions we're looking at today, spontaneous movements will emerge. People cannot go on living the way they are being asked to live, and people will want to fight back. What is it that allows something to continue and go forward and not get, we've seen too many, haven't we, shut down, stifled at birth almost, movements that suddenly become respectable or become a footnote to something we were involved in once, an occupation here that then kind of fizzled out. And so we think these are important lessons really for socialists, about how do you ensure that a movement builds on those strengths, builds on that energy and that wish to fight back, and isn't drawn down respectable channels that lead it into a dead end. So, and also, you know, I mean, it depends who's leading the movement, doesn't it? You had people like Jasmine Stone, who you saw there leading the movement. She was uncompromising. They tried to buy her off so many times. They tried to offer her decent housing for her and her daughter, and she said, I'm not top of the list. They tried to offer her, you know, whatever she wanted, they would at one point have given her to get her to stop leading that movement. And she refused. So you need your principled working class leaders, and we all, you know, depend on that, but you also need behind them something that supports them. You need open democratic meetings from which nobody, for any campaign, from which no one is excluded. And everyone has the right to participate and speak, and if they're in an organisation, distribute their literature where there's no censorship. It's the only way to make sure the class-conscious voices of those involved are heard and come to the fore. You need regular street work. You need to draw in people. You need to tell them what you're doing. So Focus E15 has held a stall outside Wilco's in Stratford, in Newham, every week for, it must be nearly 6 years now. Every Saturday they're out there, bringing people in, encouraging them to talk on the open mic, and supporting individual campaigns, going with people to the housing office, with, you know, all the mothers, all the buggies, all the people, and saying we are not leaving until this person is rehoused. So you probably need quite a lot of energy as well. You need, as I said, non-sectarianism, that welcoming in. I think John Douglas, I don't know if he's still here, said, you know, we mustn't fight amongst ourselves all the time. We mustn't exclude people because we don't like something about their politics. We need to allow everybody to take part without prioritising. For example, in our case, there was a push to sort of prioritise the voices of, I don't know, Labour councillors or official organisations, or they've got the experience, let them take the lead. And you do have to resist that. You do have to say, no, this is a campaign for everybody. We're not prioritising them. You need to have open discussion within the campaign itself. I think I was talking to someone here earlier who was talking about the question of racism in housing, and how housing is used to foster racism amongst the working class. Or, you know, why have they got a house? Are they jumping the queue? And it divides us all. And within this campaign, some of the young women you saw there were UKIP supporters, and definitely had swallowed that racist agenda about why they hadn't got a home. They didn't get kicked out. They got involved in the struggle, and they saw that they were fighting the wrong enemy, that the council, that the Labour council that wasn't providing housing, the government that was doing all these cuts, this was the enemy, and the people who were fighting for housing just like them were part of the movement, part of the struggle. And there was a radicalisation, if you like, of that whole community that goes on, whose effects are still felt today. So that's a little bit about Focus E15. And they have a website, and you can find out they're still fighting. They're fighting today about temporary accommodation, because the hostel they were kicked out of was bought back by the council and turned into temporary accommodation that is like a prison. People can't have visitors. They have to lock the doors at a certain time. It's not safe. There is damp. The children had nowhere to play until, in fact, Focus E15 went out and occupied what had been a play centre and forced the council to reopen it in the last month, I think, at the beginning of December. So they're fighting about temporary accommodation, they're fighting about out-of-borough placements, they're fighting about everybody who's being evicted and made homeless and left with nothing. And they're continuing to do that, and we need to learn from it to build something. And I want to just briefly, have I got time? Yeah. Talk about what happens when you don't run that kind of campaign, when you're not open, when you're not democratic, when you allow things to be channeled into respectable routes. And I very briefly want to talk about the campaign around Grenfell, and in fact the campaign that never was. Many of you will be familiar with what happened. It's more than, I think it's just over 18 months since the fire at Grenfell in West London claimed 72 lives. It destroyed hundreds of homes. It exposed the utter failure of the British state and of the local council to meet the needs of the working class in that area. And, you know, every week, if you follow it, brings new evidence of the crimes committed, really, against the community, about how unsafe that tower was. And it's a legacy of the degradation of social housing, really under Conservative and Labour governments in Britain over the past 50 years, the deliberate running down of publicly owned council housing. And what was needed in the wake of that fire was a mass movement, both in North Kensington, but spreading out to all the places around the country which have got inadequate cladding, which have got fire hazards, where people are being forced to live in conditions that are not acceptable. And we saw the anger of the local community the day after the fire when they occupied the town hall. And you saw the terror on the face of those councillors. And they were willing to promise anything, really, at that point. And that existed and needed to be built on. And what actually happened was within 2 days, what I would call opportunist forces that appear to be on the left, but actually exist to serve the state. And I think someone mentioned them in one of their questions, maybe one of the unions, where you wonder sometimes why some sections of it actually seem to be bringing everything back to the interests of the state. And in North London, the next thing that happened was a silent march away from the council, led by people including the local MP, the police, the great and the good, lawyers, respectful and silent. And sometimes people have a go at me and say, but that's really important, you can't knock people for being respectful and silent. But actually a silent march often has a very particular component. It's not a noisy, angry march that's going to tear things down or make a fuss or demand accountability. It's everyone just, nothing happens. And increasingly, there was a campaign set up almost immediately, the official campaign. They practically trademarked it and registered themselves at Companies House within a month. And that was the Justice for Grenfell campaign. And it held one public meeting in 18 months and one march. And when local people, and we were part of that, were trying to organise things outside the council and occupying the council every month and holding them to account, they were nowhere to be seen. And what you saw gradually was the anger being dissipated into, I think the anger is still there simmering away, but any kind of organised resistance, any kind of real upsurge that could change the conditions that the working class are being forced to live in has been deliberately, the march I mentioned is just the beginning of it. It was a drip, drip, drip of siphoning off that energy and that anger. And we can't allow that to happen, or there will be more Grenfells. You know, there's still hundreds of towers with flammable cladding on them in Britain, probably in Ireland as well. I haven't done the research on that. Only 2% of council blocks in Britain have got sprinklers, despite the recommendations of the fire services. So there will be more Grenfells unless we fight and unless we organise. And just briefly, I'm coming to the end. 2 minutes, and you say, fine. So there was something I wanted to say, because it's not just about, oh, isn't it awful, and we need to campaign against it. I think we also have to understand what is going on with housing. There is a housing crisis, and that crisis, I would argue, is a product of a crisis of the capitalist system. What many of us here, some of you are too young, but most know about is the post-war period. And we sort of look back to the era of public house building and a welfare state and health and nearly full employment and good, working conditions. And we said, well, let's fight for that. Let's get that back. But that was an exceptional period, that post-war period. I know in Britain, which it still had part of its empire, it had the proceeds of that empire and the reconstruction after the war and the fear of the Soviet Union, which had played a really important role in fighting fascism. And it was under pressure from people returning from the front. And both the economic and political situation kind of forced it to deliver a post-war consensus. But the economic conditions were important. So there was mass rollout of public house building. And those conditions don't exist anymore. They've been gradually coming to the end. By the end of the 60s, by the beginning of the 70s, crisis conditions have reasserted themselves. And capital, washing around the world, all this money they're making from exploiting people from around the world, where are they going to put it? There are no more productive outlets, profitable outlets to put it in that are productive, and it's going into land. And if you look at the graph for land prices and the onset of the crisis, they almost exactly mirror each other. Land has become the most extraordinarily profitable investment for hedge funds, insurers, mass multinational organisations, the City of London. I mean, in Kensington, where Grenfell Tower is sited, land values rose 456% in the 20 years to 2015, and that's a better investment than gold. And that is what lies behind this housing boom for profit. That's what lies behind. They're not going to build social housing. They're not going to put the money into social housing when it is so profitable to build private housing. They're not going to build on some land. They're going to leave it as land banks while the value just goes up and up and up and up. And they don't even care if their buildings are empty because their value is increasing all the time. You know, there's been called safety deposit boxes in the sky. And this is where capital is flooding. And it's massively profitable for city firms, for brokers who bank the land, for estate agents like Savills, and I'm sure you have your own versions who serve the interests of the City of London, for finance capital generally. And so when we talk about, and I've looked at the Éirígí programme of, you know, a campaign for publicly owned housing, and that's what we want and that's what we deserve, I think we have to be clear. We are taking on not just one government or another government. It's not a choice of policy for capitalism. It's a necessity for them to maintain profitability. And if we are fighting for housing, then we're fighting against a system that is creating this housing crisis, because it is a crisis that lies at the very heart of capitalism. So we need action. We need a real fight back by the working class to reclaim its rights. And as Engels also wrote, in order to make an end of this housing shortage, this is to say more than 150 years ago, there is only one means: to abolish altogether the exploitation and oppression of the working class by the ruling class. So the battle against the housing crisis is a fight against capitalism. And we'd say that only a socialist system that holds land as a common good and decent housing as a human right can solve the problem.